Jack. The man was a legend in our office. At 58, he carried himself with a confidence and charisma that most younger men could only dream of. He wasn't just my boss, he was the boss. Tall, sharp-dressed, with that silver streak in his hair that made him look like he'd stepped right out of a corporate magazine. His voice? Deep and smooth, the kind that made you stop mid-sentence just to hear him finish his thought. But what truly set him apart was the way he made you feel like the only person in the room when he looked at you. I never thought it was more than that. Admiration. Respect. But that one night changed everything. It was late. Everyone else had already left, their desks empty, the office lights dimmed to a soft glow. I stayed behind to finish a report that was due the next day. It had been one of those endless weeks, and I just wanted to get everything done so I could relax over the weekend. As I sat there, typing away, I heard the sound of footsteps. My heart skipped. The building should have been empty. I turned, and there he was. Jack, standing in the doorway, his tie slightly loosened, his blazer slung casually over his shoulder. "You still here, Jess?" His voice carried that warm, amused tone he used when he caught someone doing something unexpected. I didn't know we had such a dedicated team member. I laughed nervously, brushing the strand of hair behind my ear. "Just finishing up the quarterly report." "It's nothing." He stepped into the room, closer than I expected. "Nothing? Staying this late to finish a report? Jess, you really don't give yourself enough credit." His eyes met mine, and I felt the air shift. It wasn't just a compliment. There was something deeper in his gaze, something that made the small hairs on my neck stand on end. I just want to make sure it's perfect," I stammered, my voice barely steady. Jack smiled, setting his blazer on the back of a chair. "That's what I like about you. You always go above and beyond." But he leaned against the edge of my desk, his hand brushing lightly against the papers. "You need to take care of yourself too. Don't let this place drain you." His words were so simple, but the way he said them, low, deliberate, like a secret shared just between us, made my chest tighten. I nodded, unable to form a proper response. "Jess," he said softly, his hand now resting on the back of my chair, fingers almost grazing my shoulder. "Do you even realize how special you are? How much you stand out here?" I froze. His words hung in the air, wrapping around me like a net I couldn't escape from. My heart pounded as I felt his presence draw closer, his warmth almost tangible. I should have said something. Stood up. Walked away. But I couldn't. My voice faltered, and for the first time, I felt completely powerless. Jack's hand lightly touched my shoulder, sending a shockwave through me. "Relax, Jess. It's just me," he whispered, his voice soft but commanding. The moment felt like it lasted forever. His words, his touch, his piercing gaze, it was all too much. And yet, not enough. I tried to say something, anything to break the tension. But before I could finish, Jack leaned in slightly, his breath brushing against my ear. "You don't have to be afraid of me, Jess. I just want to see you succeed." Those words echoed in my head long after he left the room. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. The way he looked at me, the way his hand felt against my skin, the way his voice sounded when he said my name. It was wrong. It had to be wrong. But then why did it feel so intoxicating? The next morning, everything seemed normal, or at least it was supposed to be. Jack greeted me in the hallway like nothing had happened. But the look in his eyes told a different story. It wasn't the friendly smile he gave everyone else. It was sharper, more intense. And when he passed by my desk, he let his hand rest on the edge, his fingers brushing just close enough to make my pulse race. And that was just the beginning. What happened next? Let's just say it was nothing I could have prepared for. It gets so much worse, and so much better. You won't believe where this is heading. Stay with me. The days that followed felt like walking on a tightrope. I couldn't think straight. Jack's presence lingered in my mind, replaying every word, every glance, every moment. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that the late-night encounter had meant more to me than it had to him. But then he started paying me even more attention, and the lines between professionalism and something far more personal began to blur. It started with small things. A comment here, a compliment there. "That presentation you gave last week? Brilliant," he said one morning, his hand casually brushing against mine as he handed me a file. His smile stayed a second too long, his gaze a second too deep. Every time he spoke to me, it felt as though the rest of the office disappeared. I'd catch myself holding my breath when he walked past my desk, waiting for the smallest acknowledgement. And he always delivered. A nod, a whispered "Good morning, Jess," a subtle glance that no one else seemed to notice. Then came the invitation. It was late in the afternoon, and most of the office had cleared out. I was at my desk, trying to focus on a stack of emails, when he appeared out of nowhere. "Jess," he said, his voice warm and familiar, "I know a great little coffee shop nearby. You've been working too hard. Let me treat you." It was the way he said it, like it wasn't a suggestion but an inevitability. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts screaming at me to decline, but his eyes, those piercing, confident eyes, held me in place. "Sure," I heard myself say, barely recognizing my own voice. The coffee shop was small and intimate, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The kind of place where people went to disappear. Jack led the way, holding the door open for me with an easy smile. "You'll love it here," he said, his tone light but filled with an undercurrent of certainty. We sat at a table near the window, the dim light casting shadows that felt far too intimate. He ordered for both of us, and as the waitress walked away, he turned his full attention to me. "You know, Jess, I've been watching you," he said, leaning slightly forward. My stomach flipped. "Watching me?" I asked, my voice catching slightly. He smiled, a knowing, almost predatory smile. "In the best way possible. You're different. You're ambitious, smart, creative. Most people in that office are content to just get by, but not you. You're going places." The compliment should have felt flattering, but it left me unsettled. "I'm just trying to do my job," I said, looking down at my coffee cup, unable to meet his gaze. "That's what I mean. You don't just do your job. You excel at it. And I see that. I see you." His words hung in the air, heavy and charged. I looked up, meeting his eyes, and for a moment, the world around us seemed to fade. The noise of the coffee shop, the clatter of cups and chatter of voices, all of it became a distant hum. It was just us, and the weight of everything unspoken. "I don't know what to say," I admitted finally. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice low and almost conspiratorial. "I just wanted you to know that I see your potential. That I believe in you." The words should have felt empowering, but instead, they left a strange knot in my chest. The walk back to the office was quiet. Jack didn't say much, but he didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to set my nerves on edge. When we returned, the office was nearly empty, and I went straight to my desk, desperate to shake off the lingering tension. But it didn't end there. The next morning, I felt the shift. The stares, the whispers. It was subtle at first, a sideways glance from one coworker, a hushed conversation that stopped abruptly when I entered the break room. Then came the comments. "Late night with Jack?" Marcy, one of the senior associates, asked with a sly smile as I passed her desk. I froze. "Excuse me?" She smirked, leaning back in her chair. "Oh, come on, Jess. Don't play innocent. Jack hasn't the type. And, well, you're it. Young, ambitious, eager to please." Her words were laced with venom, each one cutting deeper than the last. I tried to brush it off, but the damage was done. The whispers grew louder, the looks sharper. Everywhere I went, I could feel the weight of their judgment. Jack, of course, seemed completely oblivious. Or maybe he just didn't care. He continued to find reasons to linger at my desk, to call me into his office, to create moments that felt far too personal. And each time, the tension in the office grew thicker. Then came the confrontation. It was a Friday afternoon, and the tension between Marcy and me had been building all week. I was in the break room, pouring myself a cup of coffee, when she walked in. "Jess," she said, her tone dripping with faux sweetness. "Can I ask you something?" I didn't look at her. "What is it, Marcy? What's it like being the boss's new favorite? Must be nice, getting all that attention." I turned to face her, my grip on the coffee mug tightening. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, come on," she said, rolling her eyes. "We all see it. The late-night meetings, the coffee dates. Jack's not exactly subtle." Her words sent a jolt of anger through me. "Whatever you think you know, you're wrong," I snapped. She smirked. "Am I?" Because it looks a lot like history repeating itself. You're not the first, Jess. And you won't be the last. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. That night, I couldn't stop replaying her words in my head. Was she right? Was I just another name on a list? The doubts gnawed at me, and for the first time, I began to question everything. But the next time Jack walked into my office, his smile as confident as ever, all my doubts melted away. Jess, he said, his voice like honey, I've got something exciting to discuss with you. Let's talk after hours. And just like that, I was pulled back into the game. A game I wasn't sure I wanted to play, but couldn't seem to walk away from. What happens next? You won't believe it. Stay with me. It only gets more complicated from here. The tension in the office had been building for days, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Whispers followed me everywhere, quiet at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. I could feel the weight of every glance, every smirk, every knowing look cast in my direction. It all came to a head one Thursday afternoon. I was at my desk, minding my own business, when Marcy stormed over, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. Her presence alone was enough to make my stomach twist. "Do you really think you're special?" she asked, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of those around us. I blinked, caught off guard by her directness. "Excuse me?" I asked, my tone measured, though my heart raced. Marcy crossed her arms, her expression one of thinly veiled contempt. "Don't play dumb, Jess. We all see what's going on. Late nights, private meetings, coffee runs. You're not fooling anyone." I stood up, meeting her gaze head-on. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Oh, come on," she scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Jack has a history, you know. You're just the next in line. And when he's done with you, you'll be left with nothing, just like the rest of them." Her words hit me like a slap. I could feel the eyes of the office on us, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. "Maybe you should focus on your own work, Marcy, instead of inventing stories about other people," I snapped. Marcy's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a spiteful smirk. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? Newsflash, Jess, Jack doesn't care about you. You're just another pawn in his game." My hands clenched into fists at my sides, the anger bubbling up inside me. "At least I'm not wasting my time tearing other people down to make myself feel better," I shot back. The exchange had drawn a small crowd. Heads peeked out from cubicles, and I could see a few of my coworkers whispering to each other, their eyes darting between us. The humiliation of it all burned in my chest. Before I could say anything else, a deep, commanding voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Jack's presence silenced the room instantly. He stood just a few feet away, his expression calm but his tone icy. His eyes flicked between me and Marcy, and I could feel my stomach drop. "Nothing, sir," Marcy said quickly, her voice suddenly sweet and deferential. "Just a little misunderstanding." Jack raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Get back to work," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. Marcy shot me one last venomous glance before turning on her heel and walking away. I could feel the stares of the office linger on me as I sat back down, my hands trembling slightly. Jack lingered for a moment longer, his gaze resting on me. There was no smile, no reassuring words, just a silent acknowledgement before he turned and walked away. The incident should have ended there, but it didn't. The whispers became louder, the judgment heavier. I could hear snippets of conversation as I walked by. "Did you see how Jack handled that? Totally took her side. She's definitely his new favorite. Poor Marcy." By the end of the day, I felt like I was suffocating. Every step I took in that office felt like walking a tightrope, and every glance felt like a push, daring me to fall. That evening, I stayed late, hoping to avoid running into anyone. The office was quiet, the only sounds the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I was deep in my work when I heard the door open. My heart sank as I looked up to see Marcy standing there, her face a mask of barely contained fury. "You think this is over?" she hissed, stepping closer. I stood, trying to maintain my composure. "I don't know what your problem is, Marcy, but I'm not going to stand here and argue with you." "My problem," she said, her voice shaking with anger, "is that people like you waltz in here and think you can take whatever you want. You don't care about the consequences, about the people you hurt. Her words stung, but I refused to let her see that. I'm not taking anything from anyone, I said firmly. She laughed bitterly. Keep telling yourself that, Jess. But trust me, Jack's going to chew you up and spit you out. And when he does, don't come crying to me. With that, she turned and stormed out, leaving me alone with her words echoing in my ears. The next day, I tried to put the confrontation out of my mind, but it was impossible. Marcy's accusations lingered, planting seeds of doubt that I couldn't shake. At lunch, I sat alone in the break room, staring at my untouched sandwich. The door opened, and Jack walked in, his presence filling the small space. "Jess," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "Mind if I join you?" I shook my head, and he sat across from me, his sharp eyes studying me. "You've been quiet today," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure how much to tell him. Finally, I said, "It's just office drama. Nothing I can't handle." His expression darkened slightly. "Marcy?" I nodded, surprised he knew. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "She's always been difficult. Don't let her get to you, Jess. She's just jealous." "Jealous of what?" I asked, genuinely curious. Jack's lips curled into a small smile. "Of you. Your talent, your drive, and the fact that you have my attention." His words sent a jolt through me, but before I could respond, he stood. "If she gives you any more trouble, let me know. I'll take care of it." As he walked out of the room, I felt a mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and something much more complicated. The conflict with Marcy didn't end there. It simmered beneath the surface, a constant, unspoken tension that colored every interaction. But I couldn't deny the truth of Jack's words. I had his attention, and that changed everything. The days after my confrontation with Marcy felt like a blur. Her words echoed in my mind, intertwining with my own doubts. Every glance, every whispered comment in the office felt like another piece of evidence stacked against me. But it wasn't just Marcy anymore. The way Jack looked at me, the way his compliments always seemed just a little too personal, it all started to feel suffocating. I needed answers. It was late one evening, long after most of the office had cleared out. I found myself standing outside Jack's office, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The room was immaculate, just like Jack himself, polished, precise, and exuding control. But as my eyes scanned the space, I noticed something that seemed out of place. A cabinet in the corner, its drawers slightly open. Curiosity tugged at me. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't stop myself. I walked over, my hand trembling as I pulled the drawer open further. Inside, among stacks of neatly organized files, were photographs. My breath caught in my throat as I flipped through them. They were of women. Young, professional, confident women I recognized. Co-workers who had worked under Jack. Women who had mysteriously left the company, often without explanation. And then I found something that made my stomach drop, a picture of me. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. It was candid, taken at some office event. I looked happy, unaware that I was being watched. The realization hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just a collection. It was a pattern. "Enjoying yourself?" The voice startled me, and I spun around to see Jack standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Jack," I stammered, clutching the photos to my chest. "What is this?" He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. "It's not what you think," he said, his tone calm but firm. I held up the photos, my voice shaking. "Then what is it, Jack? Why do you have these? Why do you have a picture of me?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Jess, you're overreacting. Those photos are nothing, just memories from past projects. People who worked here, people I helped." "Helped?" I snapped, my anger boiling over. "Where are they now, Jack?" "Because they're not here. Did they leave, or did you push them out when you were done with them?" His eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something darker beneath his composed exterior. "You're letting your imagination get the better of you," he said coolly. "No," I said, my voice firm. "I'm finally seeing things clearly. Marcy was right, wasn't she? This is what you do. You find someone, you make them feel special, and then you discard them. Jack stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. Jess, he said softly, almost pleading. You're different. You're not like the others. I shook my head, backing away. Don't. Don't try to manipulate me. I'm not falling for it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was deafening, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on me like a vice. Then Jack smiled, a cold, calculated smile that sent a chill down my spine. You won't leave, he said simply, his tone laced with quiet confidence. You won't walk away, because you need this job. And because part of you likes the attention. You like being seen. His words cut deeper than I expected, because they held a sliver of truth. I hated myself for it, but he wasn't entirely wrong. I had liked the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel important. But now, that feeling was tainted, corrupted by everything I had discovered. I'm not like them, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. No, he agreed, stepping even closer. You're not. That's why you're still here. That's why you'll stay. His certainty infuriated me. You don't own me, Jack, I said, my voice rising. I'm not some pawn in your game. Jack tilted his head, his smile never wavering. If that's what you believe, then prove me wrong. Walk out that door right now and never look back. I froze, his challenge hanging in the air. Part of me wanted to take it, to leave and never give him the satisfaction of winning. But another part of me hesitated, torn between anger and fear, between defiance and doubt. I don't need to prove anything to you, I said finally, shoving the photos into his chest as I pushed past him. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, confusion. The image of those photos, the way Jack had looked at me, his words, they replayed in my head on a loop. I felt trapped. Leaving the job wasn't an option. I needed it to survive. But staying meant being under Jack's thumb, constantly questioning his motives and my own sanity. The next morning, I avoided him as much as possible, burying myself in work and keeping my head down. But it wasn't long before he found me. Jess, he said, his voice low and smooth as he leaned against my desk. We need to talk. I have nothing to say to you, I replied without looking up. He sighed, his tone shifting to one of quiet authority. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Come to my office after hours. We'll figure this out. I didn't respond, and after a moment, he walked away, leaving me with a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. That evening, I found myself standing outside his office once again, my hand hovering over the door handle. I knew I shouldn't go in, but something compelled me to. Maybe it was a need for closure, or maybe it was just the hope that I was wrong about him. When I finally pushed the door open, Jack was waiting for me, his expression unreadable. I knew you'd come, he said softly. His confidence was infuriating, but I forced myself to stay calm. This can't continue, Jack, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Whatever this is, it ends now. He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine. Jess, he said, his voice almost tender. You're making this into something it's not. I've never felt this way about anyone before. You're different. But I wasn't listening anymore. His words were just another layer of the web he had spun, and I was done being caught in it. I'm done, I said, turning toward the door. You'll be back, he called after me, his voice filled with quiet certainty. They always come back. His words haunted me as I walked away, but this time, I wasn't going to let them hold me. Whatever power Jack thought he had over me was gone. I was determined to take it back, no matter what it cost. But the fallout of this confrontation? That was just beginning. You won't believe what happens next. That night, the air felt different. Heavy, electric, as though it carried the weight of everything that had been building between us. Jack had asked me to meet him in his office after hours. Part of me wanted to refuse, to finally break free from his grip. But another part of me, one I hated to admit existed, was drawn to him like a moth to a flame. When I stepped into his office, Jack was already there, leaning casually against his desk, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up. He looked at me with that same piercing intensity, and my breath caught in my throat. I didn't think you'd come, he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. I shouldn't have, I replied, my voice trembling slightly. But I stayed where I was, unable to move. He stepped closer, closing the distance between us. His presence was overwhelming, his scent intoxicating. Jess, he said, his tone low and measured, Why are you fighting this? You feel it too, don't you? I couldn't find the words to answer. My heart was racing, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and desire. He reached out, his fingers brushing against my arm, and the electricity between us was undeniable. Tell me to stop, he murmured, his hand trailing up to rest lightly on my shoulder. If you don't want this, just say the word, and I'll walk away. I opened my mouth to speak, to tell him to stop, but no sound came out. Instead, I looked up at him, and in that moment, the walls I'd built around myself crumbled. His hand moved to the side of my neck, his touch firm yet careful, as though he was testing the boundaries. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with anticipation. My pulse pounded in my ears as his other hand brushed against my waist, pulling me slightly closer. Time slowed. Every movement, every glance, every shift in his breathing felt magnified. His confidence, his control, it was magnetic. I hated him for it, but I couldn't bring myself to pull away. You're incredible, Jess, he said, his voice almost a whisper. Do you have any idea what you do to me? His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I hated how much I wanted to believe them. His hands tightened slightly on my waist, grounding me in the moment, and I felt myself leaning into him despite everything screaming at me to stop. I could feel his breath against my skin, warm and steady, as his fingers traced a slow, deliberate path along my arm. My thoughts became a blur, replaced by the undeniable pull between us. And then, it happened. It wasn't just his touch or his words. It was the culmination of every stolen glance, every lingering moment, every unspoken tension that had been simmering beneath the surface. The barriers between us shattered, and in that instant, nothing else mattered. The next morning, the weight of everything hit me like a freight train. I sat at my desk, staring blankly at my computer screen, the events of the previous night playing on a loop in my mind. Marcy's voice cut through my thoughts like a knife. She approached my desk, a smug look on her face. You know, she said, her tone dripping with mock sympathy, Jack's a creature of habit. You're not the first, Jess. And trust me, you won't be the last. Her words hit harder than I wanted to admit. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice steady but cold. She laughed lightly, shaking her head. Oh, sweetie. He's been doing this for years. You think you're special? Think again. I felt my stomach drop, her words confirming what I had been too afraid to acknowledge. I wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but deep down, I already knew the truth. Later that day, I found myself standing in Jack's office once again. He looked up as I entered, his face lighting up with that infuriatingly charming smile. Jess, he said, his voice warm and inviting. What's on your mind? I didn't sit down. Instead, I stood there, arms crossed, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. How many? I asked, my voice cold and sharp. His smile faltered, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Jess, I don't know what you mean. How many women have you done this to, Jack? I interrupted, my voice rising. How many before me? And how many will there be after? He sighed, leaning back in his chair, his confident facade slipping. It's not what you think, he said, his tone measured. Don't lie to me, I snapped, my hands trembling. Marcy told me everything. Is this just a game to you? Am I just another name on your list? Jack stood, his calm demeanor giving way to frustration. You're overthinking this, he said, his voice harder now. Yes, I've had relationships with other women in the office, but you're different, Jess. Don't, I said, my voice breaking. Don't try to spin this. You've been playing me this entire time. He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine. And what about you? He asked, his tone cutting. You knew what this was, Jess. Don't act like you didn't want it too. His words felt like a slap, but I held my ground. Maybe I did, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. But not like this. Not as part of some sick pattern. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, Jess, he said, his voice softening. I never meant to hurt you. But this is who I am. And you knew that. I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't going to change. And I couldn't stay. The next day, I handed in my resignation. As I walked out of the office for the last time, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Jack might have been a master at his game, but I wasn't going to be another piece on his board. What do you think? Was leaving the right choice? Let me know in the comments. Oh, and one last thing, this is where the story ends. Or maybe it's just the beginning.